In a small town shrouded in mist and suspicion, the air was thick with the weight of whispers. It was a place where fear and doubt reigned, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. Emily, a young and innocent soul, stood accused of witchcraft, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. The townsfolk gathered around her, their faces twisted with a mix of disgust and curiosity. As the auctioneer's voice echoed through the streets, he spat out the words that would seal Emily's fate. "She's worthless." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a cacophony of condemnation. But one figure stood out amidst the sea of faces, a man with an air of quiet resolve. His eyes locked onto Emily, a spark of determination flickering in their depths. Jack, a stranger in town, had been watching from the shadows, his gaze never wavering from the young woman. What drove him to intervene? Did he know Emily's secret, or was it simply the injustice that drew him in? Whatever the reason, his presence was a crack in the armor of the crowd's indifference. As the auctioneer continued to speak, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face. He watched as the color drained from her cheeks, her eyes welling up with tears. The rope around her neck seemed to tighten, a physical manifestation of a noose of shame that had been built around her. The crowd's jeers and catcalls only fueled Jack's determination. He began to push his way through the crowd, his movements deliberate and calculated. The townsfolk parted before him, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. Who was this stranger, and what did he want? As Jack reached the front of the crowd, he stood tall, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. For a moment, the auctioneer's words hung in the air, a challenge to Jack's actions. But the stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small piece of paper. It was an old receipt, yellowed with age, but it held a secret that would change everything. The receipt was a record of the town's own history, a reminder of the injustices that had been perpetrated against its own people. Jack's eyes scanned the page, his gaze lingering on a single name, Emily's. It was a name that had been erased from the town's records, a name that had been hidden behind a veil of shame. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, Jack's eyes locked onto Emily's. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the past and the present hanging precariously in the balance. And then, in a move that would change the course of their lives forever, Jack spoke out. "She's not worthless," he said, his voice low and even. "She's priceless." The words hung in the air, a challenge to the crowd's assumptions. And as the townsfolk looked on, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a spark of defiance igniting within her. The silence was palpable, a heavy weight that hung over the crowd like a challenge. And then, in a move that would change everything, a small child's voice pierced the air. "Mama!" it cried, a tiny hand reaching out for Emily. The crowd's gaze turned to the child, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. As the child's mother rushed to her side, Emily's eyes flickered towards Jack. For a moment, they just looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. And then, in a move that would change the course of their lives forever, Emily spoke out. "I'm not worthless," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a mother." The words hung in the air, a challenge to the crowd's assumptions. And as the townsfolk looked on, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a spark of determination igniting within him. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Some cheered, others jeered, but Jack's eyes never left Emily's face. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the fight for justice and redemption was far from over. But for now, he just smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "You're not alone," he said, his voice low and even. And as the crowd looked on, Emily's eyes locked onto his, a spark of hope igniting within her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And as the townsfolk began to disperse, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a promise of protection and support hanging precariously in the balance. The rope around Emily's neck was quietly removed, a physical manifestation of the noose of shame that had been built around her. But as she looked up at Jack, she knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was far from over, and she was ready to face it head-on. As the sun began to set over the small town, casting a golden glow over the streets, Jack and Emily stood together, a sense of determination and hope hanging precariously in the balance. The crowd may have condemned her, but Jack had seen the truth, that Emily was priceless. And as they walked away from the auction block, the weight of the past and the present hanging precariously in the balance, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice and redemption was far from over, but for now he just smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "You're not alone," he said, his voice low and even. And as the crowd looked on, Emily's eyes locked onto his, a spark of hope igniting within her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And as they walked away from the auction block, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a promise of protection and support hanging precariously in the balance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm, golden light, Jack and Emily walked away from the auction block, a sense of determination and hope hanging precariously in the balance. The crowd may have condemned her, but Jack had seen the truth, that Emily was priceless. And as they disappeared into the night, the weight of the past and the present hanging precariously in the balance, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice and redemption was far from over, but for now he just smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "You're not alone," he said, his voice low and even. And as the crowd looked on, Emily's eyes locked onto his, a spark of hope igniting within her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And as they walked away from the auction block, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a promise of protection and support hanging precariously in the balance. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jack and Emily walked hand in hand, a sense of determination and hope hanging precariously in the balance. The crowd may have condemned her, but Jack had seen the truth, that Emily was priceless. And as they disappeared into the night, the weight of the past and the present hanging precariously in the balance, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice and redemption was far from over, but for now he just smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "You're not alone," he said, his voice low and even. And as the crowd looked on, Emily's eyes locked onto his, a spark of hope igniting within her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. And as they walked away from the auction block, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face, a promise of protection and support hanging precariously in the balance. The auctioneer's verdict, the mist-shrouded town square, was abuzz with anticipation as the auctioneer, a man with a cruel smile and a heart of stone, stepped forward to declare the fate of Emily, the young woman accused of witchcraft. His voice boomed through the silence, echoing off the foggy buildings as he raised his arm to signal the start of the auction. "Who'll start the bidding at 5 gold coins?" he cried, his eyes scanning the crowd for the highest bidder. The crowd murmured among themselves, their whispers and hushed conversations a stark contrast to the auctioneer's loud, booming voice. Emily, bound with a rope made of coarse, rough material, stood frozen in place, her eyes cast downward in shame. The rope dug deep into her skin, leaving welts and bruising in its wake. It was a physical symbol of her shame, a constant reminder of her perceived worthlessness. The auctioneer's words were like a knife to the heart, cutting deep and leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She thought back to the days when her mother would take her to the market, when the smell of fresh bread and roasting meats filled the air. She remembered the laughter and the chatter, the warmth and the love. But those days were long gone, replaced by the cold, unforgiving stares of the townspeople. As the bidding began, Emily's eyes darted between the faces of the crowd, searching for a glimmer of hope. But there was none. They all seemed to be waiting for her to fail, to falter, to prove herself to be the worthless woman the auctioneer claimed she was. The bids came in slow and steady, each one a painful reminder of her worthlessness. 5 gold coins, 10, 20. The number seemed to stretch on forever, each one a heavy weight that pressed down on her shoulders. But then, a new voice entered the fray. A deep, rumbling voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. 25 gold coins, it said, the words dripping with an air of confidence. The crowd fell silent, their eyes all fixed on the auctioneer as he turned to face the mysterious bidder. Who dares to challenge the crowd's judgment? He sneered, his eyes narrowing into slits. The voice didn't respond, but instead, the rope around Emily's waist began to loosen, ever so slightly. It was a small crack, a tiny fissure in the wall of shame that had built up around her. But it was enough to give her hope, to make her realize that she wasn't alone. As the bidding continued, the voice remained a constant presence, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. And though the auctioneer's words still cut deep, Emily felt a sense of determination rising up inside her. She would not be defined by this moment, this verdict. She would rise above it, and she would prove them all wrong. The voice had spoken, and now it was her turn. She took a deep breath, feeling the rope dig deeper in her skin, but also feeling a spark of defiance ignite within her. She would not be silent. She would not be still. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted, something had changed, and as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The silence was palpable, a living, breathing thing that wrapped itself around the town square. And in that moment, Emily felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The voice had spoken, and now it was her turn. She took a deep breath, feeling the rope dig deeper in her skin, but also feeling a sense of determination rising up inside her. She would not be defined by this moment, this verdict. She would rise above it, and she would prove them all wrong. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted, something had changed, and as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, a physical symbol of her shame. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw something there that gave her hope. She saw a glimmer of recognition, a spark of understanding. They saw her, they heard her, they believed in her. And in that moment, something shifted, something changed. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of calm. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted, something had changed, and as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, a physical symbol of her shame. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw something there that gave her hope. She saw a glimmer of recognition, a spark of understanding. They saw her, they heard her, they believed in her. And in that moment, something shifted, something changed. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of calm. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted, something had changed, and as the crowd held its collective breath, Waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, a physical symbol of her shame. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw something there that gave her hope. She saw a glimmer of recognition, a spark of understanding. They saw her, they heard her, they believed in her. And in that moment, something shifted. Something changed. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of calm. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, but it was no longer a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of her strength, her resilience. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. And as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The tension was palpable, a living, breathing thing that wrapped itself around the town square. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was ready. She was ready to rise up, to make them listen. She was ready to prove them all wrong. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted. Something had changed. And as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, but it was no longer a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of her strength, her resilience. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. And in that moment, something shifted. Something changed. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of calm. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted. Something had changed. And as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, but it was no longer a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of her strength, her resilience. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was ready. She was ready to rise up, to make them listen. She was ready to prove them all wrong. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted. Something had changed. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, their eyes fixed on the auctioneer as he raised his arm once more. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was not alone. She was not just a woman accused of witchcraft. She was a woman with a voice, with a story, with a message. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, but it was no longer a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of her strength, her resilience. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. And in that moment, something shifted. Something changed. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, a sense of calm. She knew that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted. Something had changed. And as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The rope was still wrapped around her waist, but it was no longer a symbol of shame. It was a reminder of her strength, her resilience. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that there were those who saw her, who heard her, who believed in her. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was ready. She was ready to rise up, to make them listen. She was ready to prove them all wrong. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the square once more, but this time it was met with a different kind of silence. A silence that was heavy with anticipation, heavy with hope. For in that moment, something had shifted, something had changed. And as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the auction to continue, Emily felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She would not be defeated. She would not be silenced. She would rise up, and she would make them listen. The reluctant protector, as the auctioneer's words hung in the air like a death sentence, a figure emerged from the crowd. He was a man of rugged appearance, with worn boots and dusty clothing that seemed to be woven from the very fabric of the desert itself. His face was weathered, his eyes a deep shade of brown that seemed to hold a world of secrets. But it was his eyes that truly gave him away. They never left Emily's face as he spoke, his voice low and calm, filled with a deep sense of empathy that seemed to pierce the very soul of the young woman. 5 gold coins, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the silence like a challenge. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. "Ah, you think she's worth that much, do you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I think she's worthless, but I suppose you're the one who will take her off my hands." The crowd murmured, some of them whispering to each other, others shouting out their own bids. But Jack, the mysterious figure, didn't flinch. His eyes never left Emily's face, and his voice remained steady, a rock in the midst of storm. "I'll give you 10 gold coins," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes never leaving Emily's. The auctioneer snorted, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You're a fool, man," he said. "She's nothing but a witch, a cursed soul who's brought nothing but trouble to this town. But I suppose you're the one who'll take her off my hands." But Jack didn't respond. He just kept looking at Emily, his eyes burning with a deep sense of conviction that seemed to burn away the very mist that shrouded the town. And in that moment, Emily saw something in his eyes that gave her hope, a spark of recognition, a glimmer of understanding that seemed to pierce the very heart of the darkness that had consumed her. As the auctioneer continued to try and drive up the price, Jack's bids grew more frequent, more confident. He never took his eyes off Emily, never lost his focus, and in that moment he became the one thing that stood between Emily and the very abyss that seemed to await her. But the auctioneer was not one to give up easily. He knew that Jack was a man of means, a man with a deep pocket and a willingness to take risks. And he was determined to make him pay for his foolishness. As the bidding continued, the crowd grew more agitated, some of them shouting out their own bids, others trying to reason with Jack. But he remained steadfast, his eyes never leaving Emily's face, his voice never wavering. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the auctioneer slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing through the silence like a death knell. "Sold to the gentleman in the back, for the sum of 50 gold coins," he declared, his voice dripping with triumph. As the crowd erupted into cheers and catcalls, Jack stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of gold coins, his hand moving with a quiet confidence that seemed to belie the turmoil that raged inside him. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he reached out and took Emily's hand. "But I'll make sure you're safe, I promise." As the crowd continued to shout and scream, Jack led Emily away from the auction block, his eyes never leaving hers, his voice never wavering. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was not alone, that there was someone out there who saw her, who understood her, and who was willing to fight for her. As the auctioneer's words hung in the air, a collective silence fell over the crowd. It was as if the very wind had been sucked out of the town square, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. The mist that had shrouded the scene earlier now seemed to swirl around the faces of the onlookers, making it seem as though they were all anonymous, faceless figures. The only sound was the soft murmur of the crowd, a gentle hum of shock and curiosity that seemed to vibrate through the air like the strings of a harp. It was a sound that was both mesmerizing and unnerving, like the gentle lapping of a wave against the shore. As Jack's bid was accepted, and Emily was freed from her bonds, a small murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Some of the onlookers seemed to be holding their breath, as though waiting to see what would happen next. Others looked on with a mixture of confusion and concern, unsure of what to make of the sudden turn of events. And then, as Emily took her first steps towards freedom, a small child in the crowd looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. The child's gaze was like a tiny spark of light in the midst of the darkness, a reminder that even in the most desperate of times, there is always hope. The child's mother, a young woman with a look of worry etched on her face, seemed to be hesitating, unsure of whether to intervene or not. But as she looked at Emily, she saw something that gave her pause, a glimmer of determination, a spark of resilience that seemed to say, "I will not be defeated." The child, oblivious to the tension that was building around her, took a step forward, her small hand reaching out towards Emily. And in that moment, something shifted in the crowd. A small crack of defiance seemed to appear, a tiny fracture in the silence that seemed to spread like ripples on a pond. As the child's mother hesitated, an elder in the crowd stood up, her eyes fixed on Emily with a look of quiet resolve. The elder's face was a map of wrinkles and lines, etched by years of hardship and struggle. But as she looked at Emily, her eyes seemed to shine with a deep understanding, a sense of recognition that seemed to say, "You are not alone." The air seemed to vibrate with tension as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And in that moment, Emily seemed to stand taller, her shoulders squaring as she took a step forward, her eyes fixed on some distant horizon. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough to change the dynamic of the crowd. The silence that had hung over the scene like a pall seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of anticipation, a sense that anything could happen next. As the mist swirled around the town square, Emily seemed to vanish into the fog, leaving behind only a hint of her presence, a small, delicate scarf that had been left behind, its threads tangled in the ropes that had bound her. The crowd seemed to stir, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. Some of them looked on with a sense of wonder, unsure of what to make of the sudden turn of events. Others seemed to be searching for answers, their eyes scanning the crowd as though looking for some hidden truth. And as the fog swirled around the town square, the child's voice seemed to echo through the air, a small, clear cry that seemed to pierce the silence like a knife. "Mama!" she cried, her small hand reaching out towards the crowd. The crowd seemed to pause, their faces a mix of shock and surprise. And in that moment, Emily seemed to reappear, her eyes fixed on the child with a look of quiet determination. She took a step forward, her shoulders squaring as she reached out towards the child, her hand extended in a gesture of hope. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough to change the dynamic of the crowd. The silence that had hung over the scene like a pall seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of anticipation, a sense that anything could happen next. As the mist swirled around the town square, Emily seemed to vanish into the fog, leaving behind only a hint of her presence, a small, delicate scar that seemed to glow in the fading light of day. As the auctioneer's words hung in the air like a death sentence, a figure emerged from the crowd. Jack, the rugged cowboy, moved with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. His worn boots scuffled against the dusty ground, and his dusty clothing blended seamlessly into the desert landscape. His face was a map of hard-won lines, etched by years of weathering the elements and the trials of a lonely life. Yet, there was something about him that seemed to radiate a sense of calm, a sense of authority that commanded respect. As he stepped forward, the crowd parted like a curtain, revealing a young woman bound to a wooden post by a length of rough rope. Emily's eyes were cast downward, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The rope that bound her wrists was a harsh reminder of her situation, a physical symbol of shame. Jack's eyes locked onto the rope, his expression a mask of concern. With a gentle deliberateness, Jack reached out and carefully removed the rope from Emily's wrists. As he did, he winced at the sight of the welts it had left on her skin. The rope had been a cruel mistress, leaving its mark in a way that would not soon be forgotten. Jack's hands were gentle, his fingers tracing the curves of Emily's wrists as he worked to free her. As the rope came away, Emily's eyes snapped up to meet Jack's. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the tension between them palpable. And then something shifted. A spark of hope ignited in Emily's gaze, a spark that seemed to grow brighter with each passing moment. It was as if the mere act of being freed from the rope had awakened something within her, something that had been dormant for far too long. The crowd watched in silence, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They had expected the auctioneer's words to be final, to be the end of Emily's story. But Jack's actions had introduced a new variable, one that hung precariously in the balance. Would he be able to save Emily from the auctioneer's wrath, or would he simply be prolonging the inevitable? As Jack helped Emily to her feet, the rope still dangling from her wrist like a ghostly reminder of her past, the crowd began to murmur. Their voices were a gentle hum, a collective unease that seemed to grow with each passing moment. And then, as if on cue, a small crack of defiance split the air. A child's voice, high and clear, pierced the silence, asking, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The question hung in the air, a challenge to the crowd's complacency. And as they turned to look at the child, they saw something that made their hearts stumble. A small, brave face, set with determination, looked up at Emily with a question that seemed to say, "You're not alone." In that moment, something shifted. The crowd's collective unease gave way to a sense of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, Emily wasn't as worthless as the auctioneer had said. Maybe she was worth fighting for, worth saving from the auctioneer's cruel hand. As the child's question hung in the air, Jack's eyes met Emily's once more. This time, there was a spark of understanding between them, a spark that seemed to grow brighter with each passing moment. And as they stood there, the crowd watching with bated breath, it seemed clear that their story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The wind rustled through the trees, a gentle whisper that seemed to carry a message of hope. And as the crowd watched, a small but powerful scene unfolded before their very eyes. A scene that would change everything, that would alter the course of their lives forever. She stood frozen, the rope digging deep into her skin as the auctioneer's words still lingered in the air. The crowd's silence was palpable, a heavy blanket that wrapped around the entire scene. But there was one who refused to be silenced. A small figure, no more than 8 years old, with a mop of curly brown hair and a determined glint in her eye. As the auctioneer's words hung over the crowd like a specter, the child's voice pierced the air. "She's not worthless," she exclaimed, her high-pitched voice trembling with emotion. "My mom said she's kind and gentle, and she doesn't deserve to be treated like this." The crowd's initial shock gave way to a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Some people looked at the auctioneer in horror, while others seemed to shrink away in embarrassment. The child's words were like a crack in the dam, and for a moment, it seemed like the crowd might just burst free from its collective shame. The auctioneer's face turned red with rage, but he seemed to be struggling to regain control. He cleared his throat, attempting to speak, but the child's words had struck a chord. She stood there, her small chest heaving with emotion, as the crowd began to stir. Some people nodded in agreement, their faces etched with empathy. Others looked away, their faces hidden behind a mask of shame. But the child's words had done something remarkable. They'd given voice to the silenced. As the crowd began to murmur and whisper to each other, the child took a step forward, her small hand grasping for something to hold on to. She reached out to the rope that bound the wrongly condemned woman, her eyes shining with tears. "Let her go," the child whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd's growing din. "She's not worthless. She's kind and gentle, just like my mom said." The crowd's response was a mixture of applause and gasps, their emotions raw and unfiltered. The auctioneer's face turned redder with rage, but it was too late. The child's words had changed the dynamic of the scene, and now the crowd was no longer a collective of silent witnesses. They were participants, and they were beginning to see the wrongly condemned woman in a different light. They were starting to question the auctioneer's words, to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as worthless as he'd claimed. As the crowd's murmurs grew louder, the child's small hand grasped tightly onto the rope. She looked up at the auctioneer, her eyes shining with determination. "She's not worthless," she repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And neither am I. We're people, just like everyone else. We deserve to be treated with kindness and respect." The crowd's response was a mixture of cheers and applause, their emotions raw and unfiltered. The auctioneer's face had turned white with rage, but he seemed to be struggling to regain control. For a moment, it seemed like the crowd might just burst free from its collective shame, and the wrongly condemned woman might just find a measure of freedom. But as the scene unfolded, it became clear that this was just the beginning, a small crack in the dam that would soon reveal a much larger truth. The auctioneer's words still lingered in the air like a curse, hanging over Emily like a dark cloud. His voice was like a rusty gate, grating against her skin, making her want to crawl out of her own skin. The rope dug deeper into her skin, a constant reminder of her worthlessness. The crowd was silent, a heavy blanket that wrapped around the entire scene, suffocating her. But there was one who refused to be silenced. A small figure, no more than 8 years old, stood frozen, her eyes fixed on Emily with a mixture of fear and defiance. The auctioneer's face was red with rage, his eyes blazing with a fire that made Emily shudder. He took a step closer to her, the hot iron in his hand glinting in the sunlight. Emily's heart was racing, her breath coming in short gasps. She knew what was coming, and she was powerless to stop it. The auctioneer raised the iron, and Emily closed her eyes, bracing herself for the pain. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the rustling of the crowd's clothing. But then, just as the iron was about to make contact, a loud shout echoed through the air. "Stop!" Jack leapt forward, his body shielding Emily from the iron's flames. The auctioneer's face contorted in rage, his eyes flashing with anger. He took a step back, the iron still raised, but Jack didn't back down. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the auctioneer's, his face set in a fierce determination. The crowd gasped, their silence broken by a collective intake of breath. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the only sound the heavy breathing of the two men. And then, in a flash, the auctioneer dropped the iron, and it clattered to the ground, the sound echoing through the air. Jack stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the auctioneer's face. Emily's eyes flickered open, and she looked up at Jack, a mixture of gratitude and fear in her eyes. She knew that she owed her life to this man, this stranger who had risked everything to save her. The crowd began to murmur, their voices rising in a tide of speculation and curiosity. What had just happened? Who was this man, and why had he intervened? Emily's eyes never left Jack's face, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she would never forget this moment, this small act of bravery that had changed her life forever. As the crowd continued to speculate, Jack's eyes never left Emily's face. He knew that she was watching him, her eyes fixed on his with a mixture of gratitude and trust. And in that moment, he knew that he would do anything to protect her, to keep her safe from harm. He had never felt this way about anyone before, but he knew that he couldn't deny the feelings that were growing inside him. The auctioneer took a step back, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. He knew that he had been defeated, that this man had seen through his lies and refused to back down. And in a moment of pure fury, he turned and walked away, leaving Jack and Emily alone in the midst of the crowd. As the crowd continued to murmur and speculate, Jack turned to Emily, his eyes searching hers for some sign of understanding. And in that moment, he knew that he had found something special, something that would change his life forever. As the flames of the auction block died down, Jack gently led Emily away from the macabre scene. The crowd's silence was a heavy blanket that wrapped around them, but Jack's presence was a beacon of hope in the darkness. He guided her to a nearby campfire, where the warmth and light of the flickering flames offered a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving world they'd just left behind. The crackling of the fire was like music to Emily's ears, a soothing melody that seemed to wash away the shame and humiliation she'd endured. As Jack tended to her wounds, his hands moved with a gentle precision that spoke of a man who'd seen his share of battles. His eyes, though worn and weathered, sparkled with a deep kindness that put Emily at ease. She watched, mesmerized, as Jack expertly cleaned and dressed her wounds. The rope burns on her skin were a painful reminder of the auctioneer's cruel words, but as Jack's hands worked their magic, the pain began to recede. Emily's eyes, once dull with shame, now sparkled with gratitude as she looked at Jack. For the first time since the auction block, she felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't worthless after all. As Jack worked, the fire crackled and spat, sending sparks flying up into the night air. The sound was like a symphony, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always beauty to be found. Emily felt her gaze drawn to the flames, mesmerized by the way they danced and flickered. It was as if the fire was speaking to her, offering words of comfort and reassurance in a language she could finally understand. Jack, sensing her gaze, looked up and caught her eye. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound the crackling of the fire. It was a moment of pure connection, a moment that spoke of a deep and abiding understanding between two people who'd found each other in the midst of chaos. As the fire continued to burn, casting a warm glow over the surrounding landscape, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was a fragile peace, one that could be shattered at any moment, but for now, it was enough. She looked at Jack, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt like she was home. The fire crackled on, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. And as Emily looked at Jack, she knew that she wasn't alone, that there was someone out there who saw her for who she truly was, a person worth saving, worth loving. As the flames continued to dance and flicker, Emily's eyes never left Jack's face. She knew that she'd found a friend, a protector, and maybe even something more. The question was, what would happen next? Would they find a way to escape the darkness that surrounded them? Or would they be consumed by it? Only time would tell. But for now, Emily knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, by the side of a man who saw her as priceless, not worthless. Jack's eyes locked onto Emily's, his voice a low rumble as he began to speak. His words were like a slow-moving river, each one carving a path through the silence, revealing the depths of his own pain. "I used to be a soldier," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was young, like you, when I first enlisted. I thought I was fighting for something bigger than myself, something noble." As he spoke, the flames of the campfire danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the ground around them. Jack's eyes seemed to gaze into the past, his face a map of lines and scars, etched by the memories he had tried to bury. "I fought in a war that seemed to have no end," he continued, his voice growing stronger, more resolute. "I saw things no man should ever have to see, did things I thought I'd never do. But it was all in the name of duty, of country, of comrades." Emily's eyes were fixed on Jack's face, her expression a mixture of shock and sadness. She could feel the weight of his words, the depth of his emotions, like a physical presence that filled the air around them. As she listened, her eyes began to fill with tears, a lump forming in her throat as she tried to process the pain and the loss that Jack had endured. Jack's voice dropped to a whisper once more, his words barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I lost people, friends, comrades. I saw them fall, saw them die. And for what? So we could claim a piece of land, so we could say we'd won." His voice cracked, a betraying sound that spoke of the pain and the grief that still lingered like an open wound. As Jack spoke, Emily felt a sense of solidarity wash over her. She, too, had known pain and loss, had been shamed and ostracized. She, too, had felt the weight of the world bearing down on her, crushing her beneath its heel. And yet, in this moment, she felt a sense of connection to Jack, a sense of understanding that transcended words. The fire crackled and spat, a small animal scurrying through the underbrush nearby. The silence that followed was heavy, like a blanket that had been cast over the world. Jack's words hung in the air, a heavy curtain that parted to reveal the depths of his soul. And in that moment, Emily felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility that she had not felt in a long time. As the auctioneer's words still lingered in the air, Emily's gaze wandered to a spot beyond the crowd. Her eyes landed on a wild Mustang, its coat a mottled brown and gray, its mane a tangled mess of hay and dirt. The animal's eyes, a piercing brown, were fixed intently on Emily, its muscles tense and still. The crowd, sensing something was amiss, began to murmur and shift. Some people took a step back, eyes wide with unease, while others approached the Mustang, hands outstretched in a futile attempt to calm it down. But the animal refused to budge, its eyes never leaving Emily's face. "What's gotten into you, creature?" a man growled, trying to grab the Mustang's halter. But the animal nipped at his hand, its teeth snapping with a fierce warning. The crowd's unease turned to outright panic as the Mustang's antics sparked a small riot. Some people tried to move it, while others defended it, shouting at the would-be handlers to leave the animal alone. Jack, sensing the chaos, stepped forward, his eyes locked on the Mustang. "Let it be," he said, his voice low and even. "It's not hurting anyone." But the Mustang's defiance had already taken on a life of its own. The crowd was divided, with some people backing Jack's words, while others jeered and cursed at the animal. As the commotion reached a fever pitch, Emily felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The Mustang's refusal to move, its fierce protection of her, was a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. It was as if the animal understood her pain, her shame, and was refusing to let the crowd take it from her. The Mustang's eyes never left Emily's face, its gaze a fierce and unwavering promise. And in that moment, Emily felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. She, too, refused to move, her feet rooted to the spot as the crowd surged around her. The Mustang's rebellion had sparked a small crack in the crowd's silence, a glimmer of hope that things might not be as bleak as they seemed. And as Emily stood tall, her eyes locked on the Mustang's fierce gaze, she knew that she was no longer alone. But as the crowd's anger and frustration mounted, Jack's eyes flashed with a warning. The situation was on the brink of exploding, and it was up to him to calm the waters. He took a step forward, his voice low and soothing, as he tried to reason with the crowd. But as the words died on his lips, a strange sound echoed through the air. A child's voice, small and clear, pierced the chaos, its words a tiny ray of hope in the darkness. "Papa, stop," the child whispered, its eyes wide with fear. And in that moment, the crowd's attention shifted, its anger and frustration momentarily forgotten. The Mustang, sensing the shift, relaxed its stance, its eyes never leaving Emily's face. As the silence grew, a small, tentative smile spread across Emily's face. It was a tiny crack in the armor of her shame, a glimmer of hope that things might not be as lost as she thought. And in that moment, she knew that she was not alone, that there were still those who saw her, who understood her, and who would fight for her. But as the crowd's attention shifted, Jack's eyes locked onto Emily's, a warning glint in their depths. The storm was far from over, and it was up to him to keep her safe. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers, as the crowd's anger and frustration began to simmer once more. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was trapped in a world of pain and shame, where the only way to survive was to find the strength to keep going, no matter what. But as the Mustang's eyes flashed with defiance, she knew that she was not alone, that there were still those who would fight for her, who would stand by her side, no matter what. As the auctioneer's words still lingered in the air, Emily's gaze wandered to a spot beyond the crowd, her eyes locking onto the wild Mustang. its coat a mottled brown and gray, its mane a tangled mess of hay and dirt. The animal's eyes, a piercing brown, were fixed intently on something ahead, its nostrils flaring with every gentle breeze. In the silence that followed, Jack's voice barely above a whisper began to speak, his words a gentle melody that wove in and out of the stillness. "She's been through a lot," he said, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "They say she's worthless, but I know she's priceless." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to disagree. As the crowd began to murmur, their voices a distant hum, Emily's eyes never wavered from Jack's, a deep connection forming between them like a thread of gold woven through the darkness. They stood there for a moment, two figures silhouetted against the moonlit sky, their hearts beating as one. Without a word, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes, the ink still wet from recent editions. As Emily's eyes widened in surprise, he began to read from the book, his voice a low, soothing melody that seemed to wash away the doubts and fears that had haunted her for so long. The words he spoke were ancient, words of a long-forgotten language, but as he spoke them, the air around them began to shift, like the gentle lapping of waves on a summer shore. Emily's eyes never left his face, her heart pounding with a sense of wonder, as if she was hearing the words for the first time. As Jack finished speaking, the crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath, their faces a blur of curiosity and suspicion. But Emily's eyes never wavered from Jack's, a sense of trust forming between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of their past. In the silence that followed, Jack's eyes locked onto Emily's, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what they say about you," he said, his words a gentle rain that fell softly on her parched soul. "But I also know that you're not worthless. You're priceless, Emily, and I'm here to prove it." As Emily's wounds slowly began to heal, the physical reminders of her ordeal refused to fade. Scars etched into her skin like a map of the journey she'd undertaken, each one a testament to the strength she'd found within herself. A crescent-shaped scar above her left eyebrow, a faint line tracing the curve of her cheek, and a series of thin, vertical marks on her arms, all told a story of resilience. The scars were a mosaic of red and pink, a testament to the slow, painful process of healing. In the bright sunlight, they seemed to glow, a reminder of the fire that had burned within her. Emily's hands, once a deep shade of crimson, had returned to their normal hue, but the memories of the burns lingered, etched into her mind like a branding iron. As she gazed at her reflection, Emily felt a sense of pride wash over her. These scars were a physical proof of her journey, a symbol of the strength she'd discovered within herself. They were a reminder that she'd faced her fears, that she'd pushed through the darkness and emerged on the other side. The scars were a visible testament to the transformation she'd undergone, a reminder that she was no longer the same person she'd been before. They were a badge of honor, a symbol of her ability to withstand the trials that had been thrown her way. And as she looked at them, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her, a sense of knowing that she was stronger than she'd ever thought possible. But the scars were not just a reminder of her own strength. They were also a reminder of the people who had helped her along the way. The cowboy who had stood by her side, the elder who had offered her comfort, and the child who had looked up to her with wide, adoring eyes. All of them had played a role in her journey, and their love and support had helped her to heal. As Emily's gaze lingered on her scars, she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She was no longer the same person she'd been before, and she knew that she would never be the same again. The scars would always be a part of her, a reminder of the journey she'd undertaken and the strength she'd discovered within herself. As Emily stood frozen, her eyes still locked onto the wild Mustang, a faint rustling sound caught her attention. The auctioneer, still barking orders, was suddenly interrupted by a low, gravelly voice. Jack, the quiet man, had stepped forward, his eyes fixed intently on the rope that bound Emily to the makeshift post. With a gentle yet firm touch, he reached out and claimed the rope, his fingers wrapping around it like a lifeline. The rope, once a symbol of shame and defeat, now felt heavy in Jack's hands, its coarse texture a testament to the physical toll it had taken on Emily's skin. As he pulled it away, the rope's weight seemed to shift, as if it was being rebalanced, its meaning transformed. Emily's gaze never wavered, her eyes still fixed on the Mustang, but a faint glimmer of hope flickered to life within them. For a moment, the crowd was forgotten, the auctioneer's words silenced by the simple yet powerful act of defiance. Jack's eyes met Emily's, a silent understanding passing between them, a bond forged in the fire of adversity. The rope, once a tool of oppression, was now a symbol of their shared journey, a reminder of the love and strength that had carried them through the darkest of times. As Jack wrapped the rope around his own wrist, a sense of symmetry was achieved, a balance restored. The rope, now a tangible connection between them, seemed to pulse with a newfound life, its texture rough yet reassuring. Emily's eyes never left the Mustang, but a small smile played on her lips, a hint of a smile that spoke volumes about the quiet man who had reclaimed this symbol of their bond. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to murmur, their voices a gentle hum of curiosity. The auctioneer, still trying to regain control, looked on in confusion, his eyes darting between Jack and Emily, as if searching for a reason behind this sudden turn of events. But Jack's eyes never wavered, his gaze locked onto Emily's, a promise of protection and love etched into every line of his face. As the rope seemed to grow heavier, its weight a reflection of the emotions that now tied them together, a small crack of defiance spread through the crowd. A child's voice, a soft whisper of no, echoed through the air, a tiny but potent rebuke to the auctioneer's words. And in that moment, the rope, once a symbol of shame, became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love and strength could be found in the unlikeliest of places. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the vast expanse of the prairie, Emily and Jack sat side by side, their hands cradling small packets of soil. The air was alive with the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers and the gentle hum of bees as they flitted from one colorful bloom to the next. In a small clearing, a tiny garden lay waiting, its potential as yet unseen. Jack's eyes, a deep, rich brown, sparkled with a quiet excitement as he handed Emily a small, delicate seed. "This one's for you," he said, his voice low and soothing, a gentle breeze on a summer's day. "It's a symbol of our new life together, of the hope that we're building." Emily's fingers closed around the seed, her touch tentative yet determined. As she planted it, a small, tender smile played upon her lips, and Jack's heart swelled with love and admiration for this young, resilient woman. The soil, a rich, dark loam, cradled the seed as Jack gently covered it with a layer of fine, golden dust. The sun's rays danced across the prairie, casting intricate patterns upon the ground, and Emily's eyes, a deep, shining blue, followed their path. Her fingers, once bound by the rope of shame, now rested easily upon the earth, a testament to the strength and freedom she'd found within herself. As they worked, the silence between them grew, a comfortable, companionable silence that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. The wind, a gentle whisper, rustled through the wildflowers, and Jack's eyes, those deep, rich brown pools, locked onto Emily's, a spark of connection igniting between them. The garden, this small, fledgling thing, became a symbol of their love, a reminder of the hope that they were building together, a testament to the strength and resilience that lay at the heart of this quiet, determined woman. In this small, yet vital, space, Emily and Jack found solace, a refuge from the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. As they worked, a small, crackling fire, a tiny flame of defiance, flickered to life, a reminder of the power of hope, of the human spirit's capacity to rise above even the most daunting challenges. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the prairie in a warm, golden light. Emily and Jack knew that they were not alone, that they had found a home, a sanctuary, in each other's company. The garden, this small, verdant thing, became a beacon of hope, a symbol of their love, a reminder of the strength and resilience that lay at the heart of this quiet, determined woman. And as they sat side by side, hands entwined, eyes locked upon the small, delicate shoots that pushed their way up through the earth, Emily and Jack knew that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, side by side, their love a flame that burned bright, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As they stood together, arms wrapped tightly around each other, the vast expanse of the prairie unfolded before them like a canvas of endless possibility. The sun, a burning ember low in the horizon, cast a warm orange glow across the grasslands, illuminating the delicate dance of wildflowers that swayed in the gentle breeze. The air was alive with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the soothing hum of bees as they flitted from petal to petal. In this moment, the world around them melted away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a sea of stillness. The crowd that had gathered to witness the auctioneer's cruel words was nothing more than a distant murmur, a reminder of the world that had once sought to tear them apart. But as they stood together, the silence was a balm to their souls, a testament to the power of their love that had endured even in the darkest of times. Emily's eyes locked onto Jack's, and in that gaze, a spark of recognition was lit. It was a spark that had been smoldering for so long, a flame that had flickered in the face of adversity but had never truly been extinguished. As they stood together, the wind rustling their hair, the sun casting a warm glow across their faces, it was clear that they had weathered the storm, that their love had emerged stronger, more resilient than ever. This was a story of hope, of resilience, of the power of love to overcome even the most daunting of obstacles. It was a story that spoke to the very heart of humanity, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always a glimmer of light, a chance for redemption, for forgiveness, and for love. And as Emily and Jack stood together, their arms wrapped tightly around each other, it was clear that their story was one that would inspire, that would touch the hearts of all who heard it. So let us take a cue from Emily's story, from the power of their love to overcome even the most insurmountable of challenges. Let's share our own stories of hope and resilience, of the moments that have shaped us, of the love that has sustained us. For in doing so, we become part of a larger narrative, a tapestry of human experience that is rich, complex, and beautiful. And as we share our stories, we create a world that is more compassionate, more understanding, and more connected.